August 20th, 2018. 10 a.m. The courtroom is silent. Too silent. A father stands. His chest rises and falls as if every breath is a battle. His eyes lock on the man who destroyed his world. And then, in a voice that cuts like glass, he says, "You heartless monster, prison is too good for you." The walls of that courtroom could not contain the weight of those words. Some whispered that no punishment could ever match the crime. Others questioned, is there a punishment beyond prison that could? But here is the question no one dares ask aloud. What kind of man forces a grieving father to wish for a fate worse than life behind bars? The fragments linger. A police bodycam flickers. A late-night text left unanswered. A smiling mother holding her children. A man in an interrogation room shifting in his seat. No answers. Only shadows. And so we begin, not with clarity, but with the questions that still burn. What happened inside that Colorado home? Who is Chris Watts when no one is watching? And how far must love be pushed before it erupts into words that the world will never forget? Shanann Catherine Watts was born on January 10th, 1984, in Passaic, New Jersey, and grew up in Aberdeen, North Carolina. From childhood, she carried both determination and difficulty. Later in life, she would be diagnosed with lupus, an autoimmune disease that caused her constant pain, exhaustion, and long hospital visits. Yet she refused to surrender to it. Friends recalled how she poured her energy into proving she could build a full life despite the illness. After high school, Shanann pursued opportunities in North Carolina, eventually working in a children's hospital and later in a business role. By her 20s, she was determined to stand on her own 2 feet. She even bought her own home, a large, 5-bedroom property in Kannapolis, North Carolina. It was both a financial milestone and a personal victory. Proof that she was capable of creating stability for herself. But stability came at a cost. She was still battling health challenges and recovering from her first marriage, which ended in divorce. In 2010, Shanann met Christopher Lee Watts, then a mechanic from Spring Lake, North Carolina. Their first connection came through Facebook when Shanann accepted his friend request. At the time, she said she wasn't searching for a relationship, but Chris showed consistency. He stood by her through doctor visits, and Shanann later said he supported her when she was at her weakest. To her, that loyalty mattered. To her family, especially her father Frank Razusek Sr., Chris appeared shy but dependable. Frank wanted to believe his daughter had found a steady partner, though, like many fathers, he carried quiet reservations. On November 3, 2012, Shanann and Chris were married in a small ceremony in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Soon after, the couple relocated to Frederick, Colorado, settling into a 2-story house on Saratoga Trail. It was there they began raising their family. Their first daughter, Bella Marie Watts, was born on December 17, 2013. Their second daughter, Celeste Cece Catherine Watts, followed on July 17, 2015. For Shanann, motherhood was everything. She juggled caring for 2 children while managing her lupus, often relying on medications and treatments to keep going. Yet her Facebook page painted the picture of joy and love. Videos showed Bella singing songs and Cece giggling, with Shanann proudly filming every milestone. She posted about birthdays, vacations, and even the simple joys of bedtime routines. Social media became her diary, a place where she could capture the family she was building, even on the days when exhaustion weighed her down. By May 2018, Shanann announced she was pregnant again, this time with a son, whom she and Chris named Nico Lee Watts. Wearing a shirt that read, "Oops, we did it again," she shared the news online with excitement. For her, baby Nico represented hope renewed, the dream of expanding her family, giving Bella and Cece a little brother, and creating a complete life despite every obstacle she had overcome. Through it all, Shanann's relationship with her father, Frank Razusek Sr., remained unshakable. Frank was more than a parent. He was her confidant, her protector, and her advisor. When Shanann struggled with illness, Frank reminded her she was stronger than the disease. When her first marriage fell apart, he reassured her that she still deserved happiness. And when she walked down the aisle to marry Chris, Frank silently prayed his daughter was safe in the hands of the man she chose. Frank adored his granddaughters. Bella called him Papa, and their visits to North Carolina filled his life with joy. He admired how Shanann embraced motherhood, balancing her health and her work while never failing to pour love into her children. To him, Shanann was proof of resilience. She was the little girl he once carried in his arms, now grown into a woman who had faced illness, heartbreak, and exhaustion, yet kept building her dreams. This bond between father and daughter would one day explain the fury and anguish in Frank's voice as he stood in court. For when he declared, "You heartless monster, prison is too good for you," those words carried the weight of a lifetime of love. They carried the memory of Shanann's battles and victories, the laughter of Bella and Cece, and the unborn future of baby Nico. Before the crime, before the betrayal, there was only this: a woman who fought to live, a mother who adored her children, and a father who treasured her as his pride and joy. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina, to Ronnie and Cindy Watts. From childhood, people knew him as the boy who kept to himself. He wasn't loud, he wasn't disruptive, he was the quiet one. Teachers remembered his politeness. Classmates noticed how he blended into the background. He developed a fascination with cars and NASCAR, passions that filled the silence he rarely broke. For Chris, words were scarce. Silence was his comfort. As he grew older, that silence shaped his identity. After finishing high school, Chris attended the NASCAR Technical Institute in Mooresville, North Carolina. There, he studied engines and mechanical systems, excelling in work that demanded precision rather than conversation. Eventually, his skills brought him to Colorado, where he secured a position with Anadarko Petroleum as an oil field operator. His colleagues described him in familiar terms: quiet, dependable, always early, never confrontational. To most, he was the kind of man you could count on for a task, but not for a story. The quiet was still there. Steady, predictable, and unreadable. To neighbors on Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, Chris played the role of the quiet family man. He pushed his daughters on swings in the yard, smiled faintly when waved at, and appeared devoted to the life Shanann documented so proudly on social media. Shanann's energy filled every gathering. She laughed easily, spoke openly, and shared her life online with confidence. Chris hovered in the background, nodding when spoken to, but rarely volunteering much of himself. To Shanann's family, especially her father Frank Razusek, Chris seemed reserved, maybe even painfully shy, but never threatening. The image of the quiet husband was accepted without question. But inside the Watts family, tensions were building. The summer of 2018 became a breaking point when Shanann and the girls traveled to North Carolina to visit family. During that trip, an incident with Chris' mother, Cindy Watts, cut deeply. Cindy offered ice cream with nuts to Bella and Celeste, despite knowing that Cece had a severe tree nut allergy. Shanann confronted her, furious at the disregard for her daughter's health. Cindy dismissed the concern, and Chris stood by silently. He didn't defend Shanann. He didn't challenge his mother. He simply let the conflict sit in the air, unresolved. For Shanann, it wasn't just about ice cream. It was about loyalty. It revealed Chris' inability, or refusal, to stand up for his wife and children, even in matters of safety. When Shanann returned home, she carried not just the weight of that conflict, but also the excitement of her pregnancy. In June 2018, she had announced that she was expecting their third child, a boy they named Nico. She wore a shirt with playful words, "Oops, we did it again," and shared the news with joy. For Shanann, Nico represented hope renewed, a family growing stronger, a future expanding. But while Shanann celebrated life, Chris withdrew further. The timing was cruel. As she embraced motherhood once more, he was envisioning a life without her at all. That same summer, Chris began changing in ways that unsettled those closest to him. He dropped weight rapidly, devoted himself to workouts, and started paying unusual attention to his appearance. He bought new clothes, cared about his physique, and projected an image of transformation. To Shanann, it was confusing. Why now? Why this sudden fixation? At first, she encouraged it, praising his progress. But beneath her encouragement lay suspicion. Her texts revealed her unease. She told him she felt him slipping away, that she didn't understand how he had become so distant so quickly. The truth was that Chris had begun a secret relationship with Nicole Kessinger, a coworker he met at Anadarko in June 2018. Nickel later told investigators that Chris presented himself as a man already separating, a father preparing for divorce. Their relationship escalated quickly. Late-night phone calls, hotel rooms, dinners out. Chris told Shanann he was working overtime, but receipts, phone records, and GPS data told a different story. He wasn't working late. He was building a double life. Shanann's messages throughout July reveal her heartbreak. In one text, she wrote, "I just don't get what's going on with you. You've changed so much. I feel like I'm losing you." Her tone shifted from hope to desperation. She begged him to talk to her, to explain, to reassure her. But Chris responded with distance. He offered cold replies, vague excuses, silence where warmth used to be. For Shanann, it was like living with a stranger. Friends noticed too. Nicole Atkinson, Shanann's best friend, said Chris no longer looked like a man invested in his family. He seemed detached, distracted, tethered to his phone. During a company trip to Arizona in early August, Shanann confided to co-workers that she no longer recognized her husband. Once, he had been her partner in everything, from doctor visits to parenting struggles. Now, he was unreachable, emotionally absent, even as they prepared to welcome a new baby into their lives. And technology was watching all of it unfold. Chris' phone contained the timeline of his lies, late-night searches for vacation getaways, love songs exchanged with Nicole, secret messages sent while Shanann slept in another room. The neighbor's surveillance camera recorded his comings and goings, the unusual movements in his driveway. Shanann's Apple Watch tracked her activity and health, even on the morning she disappeared. Their digital lives would become the silent witnesses that exposed his double life, leaving a trail he could not erase. The cracks were widening. Shanann was reaching out, pleading for answers. Chris was withdrawing further, consumed by a fantasy of starting over. To their neighbors, nothing looked wrong. To Shanann's father, Chris was still the same quiet man he had always been. But in truth, Chris was already gone. His silence had hardened into something dangerous, his detachment into something irreversible. By August 2018, the house on Saratoga Trail looked like the perfect picture of a growing family. A pregnant mother, 2 little girls, a father who appeared calm and reliable. But the reality was something else, a marriage unraveling, a man split between 2 lives, and a silence so deep it concealed the darkest intentions. The question wasn't whether Chris was hiding something. The question was how far he was willing to go to keep it hidden. Shanann Watts was supposed to be at her OB/GYN appointment at 10 a.m. She had spoken about it with joy, eager to hear her unborn son's heartbeat again. But when she failed to arrive, her absence sent immediate alarm through those who knew her best. Shanann did not miss appointments. She did not vanish without explanation. She lived her life in careful patterns, from her children's medications to her own lupus treatments. Her silence that morning was the kind of silence that shouted. Her friend, Nicole Atkinson, who had dropped her off at home just hours earlier after a late-night work trip, grew uneasy. Calls went unanswered. Texts remained unread. By early afternoon, Nicole drove to the Watts home on Saratoga Trail. Shanann's car was still in the driveway. The house looked still, almost staged, like a snapshot of life frozen. She rang the bell, knocked on the door, even peered through windows. No answer. No sound of the girls playing. No footsteps upstairs. A growing panic pressed at her chest. Nicole knew Shanann. This was not right. She called the police. In Aberdeen, North Carolina, Shanann's father, Frank Razusek, was told his daughter could not be reached. His reaction was immediate and unwavering. She wouldn't just leave. He knew his daughter's devotion to Bella and Celeste. He knew she was 15 weeks pregnant with baby Nico and counting down the days until his birth. He knew how she fought through exhaustion and illness to keep life steady for her girls. For Frank, there was no doubt. Something was terribly wrong. That afternoon, Officer Scott Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department arrived at the Watts residence. His body-worn camera would later provide a chilling record of the first entry into the home. The footage shows Chris Watts answering the door, his voice calm, his movements measured. He wore a t-shirt and shorts, his tone almost casual as he explained Shanann might be with friends, or maybe she had gone out unexpectedly. He opened the door wider, inviting the officer and Nicole inside. To the untrained eye, it looked like cooperation. But beneath that calm was a stillness too controlled, a performance too tidy. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt unsettling. Shanann's purse sat on a chair in the kitchen, her wallet still inside. Her phone lay on the couch, the charger still plugged into the wall, the screen black and lifeless. Upstairs, her medications, crucial for lupus management, were untouched on the bedside table. In the children's rooms, the beds were neatly made, but the girls were nowhere to be found. Even Cecé's EpiPens, essential in case of a severe allergic reaction, remained in the drawer. These were not things Shanann would ever leave behind. They were essentials, lifelines, the rhythms of her family's daily life. The absence of her and the girls was not voluntary. The house spoke it plainly. Chris moved through the rooms, gesturing, offering explanations. He suggested Shanann might have left for a playdate, maybe gone to a friend's. He pointed out her car still in the garage, repeating theories that felt practiced. His words moved, but his eyes did not. He leaned against the counter, folded his arms, shifted his weight from one leg to the other. The small gestures of a man aware he was being watched. His calmness, once read as shyness, now felt like something else entirely, a mask stretched too tightly. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering. One pointed out that Shanann was deeply attached to her children, that she would never walk away without them. Another mentioned how unusual it was to see Chris acting so detached. The most telling moment came when neighbor Nate Trinastick offered to show the officer his home security footage. Together, they watched the grainy video captured from across the street. It showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway around 5:27 a.m., an action he almost never did. The footage caught him pacing back and forth, loading items into the truck, though the camera's angle obscured exactly what they were. As the footage played, Nate glanced at the officer, then at Chris. "He's not acting right, man," Nate said. His suspicion was not about the footage alone. It was about the man standing beside him, fidgeting, smiling without warmth, commenting on the video as though rehearsing lines. Chris deflected, suggesting the camera was unreliable, offering casual explanations for why he parked differently that morning. But his composure began to fray. His arms crossed tighter. He shifted again, now bouncing lightly on his heels. His calm was not natural. It was labored, a stillness rehearsed. For the officer, the details added up quickly. The purse, the phone, the medication, the empty car seats, the husband's unusual composure. These were not the markers of a family trip or a voluntary absence. They were markers of a disappearance under shadow. The officer began treating the home with caution, noting the strangeness of every detail. By nightfall, the urgency escalated. Detectives pressed Chris for a timeline. He told them Shanann had returned from her trip at nearly 2 in the morning, that they had a quiet conversation, and that when he left for work before dawn, she and the children were still asleep in bed. He repeated the same story, word for word, like a man clinging to a single rope. He suggested maybe she had left him, maybe she was angry, maybe she needed space. But his words rang hollow, and everyone who knew Shanann rejected them outright. Because Shanann Watts did not run away. She did not abandon Bella and Cece. She did not skip her OB/GYN appointment or leave behind her medication. Her life was her children. Her pregnancy was her joy. And Frank, sitting in North Carolina with the phone pressed to his ear, knew it with unshakable certainty. His daughter was missing, but not by choice. The house on Saratoga Trail, once the backdrop of Shanann's smiling videos, had become something else entirely. A stage where a man performed calmness while the evidence around him screamed contradiction. He gestured to her purse, but never asked where she was. He pointed out her car, but never pleaded for her return. He repeated theories, but never showed the fear of a husband or father in crisis. And so the question was not just where Shanann and the girls had gone. The question that night, in that living room, as the camera recorded Chris' every move, was this: would you trust the man pointing out his wife's belongings while never once asking where she was? Chris Watts sat in a small interview room at the Frederick Police Department. The blinds were half closed, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. Across from him, detectives leaned forward with open notepads, studying his every movement. Chris folded his arms tightly, then unfolded them. He rubbed his hands together, tapped his fingers, shifted in his chair. His voice was soft, his words deliberate, as though each sentence had been rehearsed. He told them he and Shanann had argued that morning, that she had told him she was leaving with the girls. A few minutes later, he suggested she might have gone to a friend's house. Then he circled back to say she was upset and needed time alone. His stories overlapped like threads that didn't match, weaving a pattern detectives immediately recognized as contradiction. The officers noted his body language. When asked about Shanann's pregnancy, Chris avoided her name and referred instead to the baby. When pressed about her friends, he deflected, saying she had many and might have gone to one of them. His explanations were vague, his details thin. He filled the silence with words like maybe and I think, phrases that bought him seconds but not credibility. Detectives, seasoned in spotting deception, wrote in their notes, evasive, inconsistent, avoiding direct answers. Outside of the interview room, neighbors were speaking up. Nate Trinastick, the man whose security camera had recorded Chris' early morning movements, told police that nothing about Chris' demeanor felt right. Nate recalled how Chris had stood in his living room watching the footage, arms crossed, talking too much, pointing out small things that weren't relevant. He's acting weird. He's not himself, Nate told them. He explained that Chris normally parked on the street, yet on the morning Shanann vanished, he backed his truck into the driveway and spent minutes going back and forth between the garage and the vehicle. Nate didn't know what Chris was loading, but he knew it wasn't normal. Other neighbors echoed his unease, whispering to officers that Chris seemed too calm, too controlled, like a man rehearsing grief instead of feeling it. In North Carolina, Frank Rzusek was living his own private torment. He stayed glued to his phone, calling anyone who might have news, waiting for updates from investigators hundreds of miles away. The television in his living room flickered with news coverage of his missing daughter and granddaughters. When Chris appeared on camera pleading for their return, Frank watched closely. He studied his son-in-law's folded arms, the way his eyes drifted from the lens, the flatness in his voice. To Frank, those weren't the actions of a desperate husband. They were the actions of a man pretending. He whispered to himself the truth his heart already knew. She wouldn't just leave. Detectives increased the pressure. They brought cadaver dogs into the Watts home, allowing the animals to search room by room. The dogs alerted in the master bedroom and near the stairs, their handlers noting the strong responses. For investigators, this was a chilling moment. The alerts suggested that human remains had been present inside the very house Chris claimed his wife and children had simply walked out of. The home, once filled with Shanann's laughter and the girls' songs, was now signaling evidence of death. At the same time, phone records and digital data told their own story. Shanann's phone showed no activity after 2 a.m. on August 13th, just hours before her scheduled appointment. Her social media accounts, usually filled with posts, remained silent. Chris' phone records revealed a flood of messages with Nicole Kessinger, the woman he had secretly been seeing. GPS data from his work truck placed him at a remote Anadarko oil site in Weld County that same morning, aligning precisely with the hours Shanann and the girls were reported missing. Each piece of data chipped away at his words, exposing the contradictions he couldn't explain. Chris tried to hold steady. In interviews, he leaned on the same lines. Shanann had left. She might have been angry. She might have taken the children. But the detectives weren't just listening to his words. They were watching the way he delivered them. They saw his lips press thin when confronted with evidence. They saw his hands fidget on the table when asked about the truck. They noticed how he smiled faintly at odd moments, how he avoided eye contact when Shanann's name was spoken. His composure was not the calm of innocence. It was the fragile stillness of a man straining to keep a mask in place. Outside, the world was watching. News stations replayed Chris' porch interview, showing him folding his arms, rocking slightly on his heels, telling cameras, "If you're out there, just come back." To many, it sounded hollow. Social media lit up with commentary, strangers analyzing his tone, his posture, his choice of words. Friends of Shanann were furious. They knew her devotion to her daughters. They knew her excitement about baby Nico. They knew she would never vanish on her own. And now they were forced to watch Chris standing in front of reporters, performing worry without showing it. For Frank, the pain deepened with every broadcast. He saw the man his daughter had married, standing in the driveway of the home she had built, asking for her return without shedding a tear. Frank's anguish grew heavier. He knew Shanann. He knew Bella and Cece. He knew they were gone. though he didn't yet know how. The sound of Chris' voice on television was not comfort. It was salt in a wound that would never heal. As detectives circled closer, the forensic evidence mounted. The cadaver dog's alerts, the phone records, the GPS data, each one tightened the noose. In the interview room, Chris adjusted in his seat, repeated his phrases, clung to his lies. But the walls were closing in. He was no longer just a husband answering questions. He was a suspect sitting under the weight of evidence. And the detectives across from him, seasoned and patient, were waiting for the moment his mask would finally break. Because the truth was no longer hiding in shadows. It was in the phone logs, in the GPS pings, in the dog's alerts, in the neighbor's suspicions, and in the eyes of a father who knew his daughter would never walk away. The only question left was how long Chris Watts could hold his mask before it shattered completely. And when he agreed to take a polygraph test, detectives knew the performance was almost over. The interrogation room was quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of papers. Chris Watts sat at the table, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his eyes fixed on a spot just above the detectives' heads. He spoke softly, almost politely, but the words he offered were brittle. He said Shanann had come home late from her business trip. He said they had an emotional conversation. He said when he left for work before dawn, Shanann and the girls were still in bed. Minutes later, he shifted the story. He said Shanann had told him she was going to a friend's house. Later still, he suggested she had taken the kids to a playdate. The contradictions stacked one on top of the other, each small change widening the gap between his words and the truth. Detectives watched carefully. They noted how he avoided Shanann's name, often replacing it with she or her. They noticed how he over-explained small details, but when pressed on timelines, he retreated into vagueness. His body betrayed him too. He tapped his fingers against the table, rubbed his hands together, shifted his weight from side to side. Calm at first glance, but the kind of calm that felt rehearsed. For investigators trained in deception, the signs were unmistakable. Then they made their offer. Would he take a polygraph test? Chris smiled faintly, even nodded, insisting he was ready. "I've got nothing to hide," he said. It was a confident reply, but confidence built on a mask he thought could never slip. That afternoon, he sat with the examiner, wires clipped to his chest, straps tightened around his torso, sensors monitoring his pulse and his sweat. The questions were simple, direct, and devastating. Did he know where Shanann was? Did he cause her disappearance? Did he harm Bella or Celeste? Each time he answered no. His voice stayed level, but the machine recorded what his body could not conceal, the tremors of a man lying. When the test ended, the examiner returned with the results. She looked Chris in the eye and said firmly, "You did not pass the polygraph." The words landed like a stone in water. Chris blinked, his lips parting, but no denial came. He didn't demand another test. He didn't protest. He just shifted in his chair, his hands clasped tightly, as if holding himself together. The examiner leaned closer, her voice cutting through the silence. "It's time to stop lying. You know what happened. You did it, didn't you?" The confrontation was deliberate, each sentence crafted to break his defenses. Detectives laid out the evidence one piece at a time. They told him cadaver dogs had alerted inside the house. They reminded him that Shanann's purse and phone were still in the living room. They pointed out the neighbor's surveillance footage showing him backing his truck into the driveway at dawn, moving back and forth for minutes. They showed him his phone records, heavy with calls to Nicole Kessinger, the woman he had been seeing in secret. They revealed the GPS data from his work truck, placing him at an Anadarko oil site in Weld County on the morning Shanann and the girls vanished. The facts were closing in from every side, leaving him with nowhere to run. Chris leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his head in his hands. He exhaled slowly, as though the weight of his lies was pressing down on his chest. For hours, he had repeated the same story, circling the same words. But now the detectives demanded more. They told him directly, "There is only one truth, Chris, and you haven't told it yet." Finally, he asked for his father. He wanted to speak with Ronnie Watts, who had flown in from North Carolina to support him. Detectives agreed, stepping out of the room and bringing Ronnie inside. The cameras kept rolling. Ronnie sat beside his son, his voice gentle, his eyes searching for honesty. Chris leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper. With trembling words, He admitted Shanann was gone, but he didn't admit to killing her outright. Instead, he claimed that after an argument, Shanann had harmed the girls, and in a fit of rage, he killed her. It was a lie designed to shift blame onto the woman he had already silenced. The moment was chilling. Chris wept softly as he told his father, "She hurt the kids, and then I lost it." Ronnie sat stunned, his hand resting on his son's back, his face heavy with disbelief. In that room, father and son shared words that would never be forgotten. For the detectives listening just outside, the confession, even laced with lies, was enough. The mask had cracked. Chris Watts had finally admitted that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste would never be coming home. When investigators returned, Chris repeated the same version to them. He claimed Shanann had strangled Bella and Cece, and that he had reacted in anger. Detectives did not believe him. The evidence would later prove this story false. But the crucial wall of denial had collapsed. The man who had smiled for cameras on his porch, pleading for his family's return, had revealed himself as their killer. Far away in Aberdeen, North Carolina, the Rzusek family received the call. Detectives told Frank and Sandy Rzusek that Chris had confessed. For Frank, the words landed like a blow to the chest. His daughter, his granddaughters, his unborn grandson, gone at the hands of the very man who had vowed to protect them. Frank sank into silence, shaking his head, whispering the same words he had said from the beginning. She wouldn't just leave. Only now, the truth was worse than anything he had imagined. She hadn't left. She had been taken. The anguish was unbearable. Frank thought of Shanann's resilience, her laughter, her fight through illness and hardship. He thought of Bella, 4 years old, singing songs in the back seat of the car. He thought of Cece, just 3, full of energy and mischief. He thought of baby Nico, whose heartbeat Shanann had been so eager to hear on the day she vanished. And now he was told that Chris, the quiet husband, the man who smiled in family photos, had destroyed them all. The confession shattered not only the Rzusek family, but also the illusion of the Watts household. The suburban home on Saratoga Trail, once the backdrop of Shanann's cheerful videos, was now marked as a place of betrayal. Chris Watts had confessed to killing his pregnant wife and disposing of his daughter's bodies in oil tanks at his work site. The details were incomplete, his version still laced with lies, but the core truth was undeniable. He was the man responsible. For investigators, it was the turning point. For Frank, it was the collapse of his world. The unmasking was now complete, but the story was not yet finished. Ahead lay the courtroom, where Frank would stand face to face with the man who had destroyed his family. And there, his grief would erupt into words that echoed across the nation. "You heartless monster! Prison is too good for you." On the morning of August 16, 2018, investigators drove down a dirt road in Weld County, Colorado, toward an isolated Anadarko petroleum oil site. The land stretched flat and endless, broken only by dry grass, steel tanks, and the occasional hum of machinery. It was a place built for industry, not for life. Yet here was where Chris Watts had told them to look. Officers stepped out of their vehicles with heavy boots sinking into the soil, knowing that beneath this silent field lay the answer to a family's disappearance. The sun beat down on the crew as they began their search, and the weight of expectation hung thick in the air. Not far from the tanks, investigators noticed a patch of earth that looked disturbed. The soil was loose, uneven, and lighter in color than the ground around it. They knelt, began to dig carefully, and soon uncovered the outline of a sheet. Wrapped inside was the body of a woman. It was Shanann Watts. She had been buried in a shallow grave, her body discarded just inches beneath the soil. She was 15 weeks pregnant with her son, Nico, a life never given the chance to begin. Officers noted the condition of her body: scratches, torn nails, signs of struggle, and the cruelty of her burial. A mother carrying new life had been left alone in the dirt by the man she trusted most. The image was devastating, and even hardened detectives felt their stomachs tighten at the sight. But the horror did not end there. Attention turned to the massive oil tanks that loomed nearby. Chris had admitted to hiding Bella and Celeste there. Investigators climbed the ladders, their gloves slick with sweat, and opened the narrow hatches at the top. The smell hit first, the thick, suffocating odor of crude oil that clung to the air and burned the throat. Inside the darkness of the tanks, officers found what no parent or detective should ever see. The small bodies of Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3, had been forced through openings barely wide enough for them to fit. Their pajamas were still on, soaked in oil, their tiny limbs twisted by confinement. Even the most seasoned officers looked away. One placed his hand against the metal tank and bowed his head. Another whispered a prayer under his breath. Radios that usually crackled with chatter fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. The site was still. The digging stopped, the machinery paused, and the officers stood in silence. They had seen death before, but this was different. A pregnant mother in the dirt. 2 little girls hidden in tanks meant for chemicals, their innocence violated by a father's hands. It was a moment when the weight of the crime demanded stillness, when grief overpowered procedure. Some officers wiped tears discreetly, others stared blankly at the horizon. The silence was not just respect for the dead, it was the only response left in the face of such brutality. Back in North Carolina, the Rzusek family received the news. Detectives told Frank and Sandy Rzusek that Shanann, Bella, and Cece had been found. Frank sat still, the phone pressed to his ear, unable to speak at first. The words echoed in his mind, each one heavier than the last. His daughter, his granddaughters, his unborn grandson, discarded like refuse by the man they had trusted. He whispered, almost to himself, how could he do this to his own children? It was not a question that expected an answer, but the raw disbelief of a father crushed under grief. Sandy wept beside him, clutching a framed photo of Shanann, while Frank lowered his head into his hands. The silence in their home that night was as heavy as the silence at the oil site, both broken only by tears. As word spread, the story leapt from Colorado to every corner of the nation. Headlines in bold letters filled television screens. Pregnant mother and 2 daughters found dead. Husband confesses. Cable news anchors repeated the details, their voices trembling with a mix of professionalism and disbelief. Photos of Shanann smiling with Bella and Celeste flashed across screens, a cruel reminder of what had been lost. Social media lit up with outrage, strangers mourning children they had never met, condemning Chris Watts as a monster. People shared Shanann's videos, her cheerful posts about family life, now unbearable in hindsight. The betrayal cut deeper because the family had seemed so perfect. If it could happen to them, could it happen to anyone? Neighbors who had once waved to Chris in the driveway now stood in front of cameras, stunned. One neighbor told reporters, she loved those girls. There's no way she would have just left them. He fooled us all. Another shook her head, unable to find words, her eyes brimming with tears as she clutched her child close. The neighborhood that once buzzed with children playing now felt hollow, haunted by the memory of Bella's laughter and Cece's energy. Reporters swarmed the street, microphones extending over flower bouquets and stuffed animals left on the front lawn. The Watts home became a shrine of grief, its porch covered with candles, its yard crowded with people whispering prayers. Vigils were held across the community. In Frederick, hundreds gathered in the town square, holding candles that flickered in the evening breeze. A child placed a teddy bear at the foot of a memorial, its small arms stretched wide as if to hug. Strangers held each other as names were read aloud. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico. The crowd sang softly, voices breaking, tears rolling down cheeks. The air was filled with grief, but also with solidarity. A community united in mourning, refusing to let the victims be forgotten. The brutality shocked even those who had seen violence before. Detectives who had worked homicides for decades admitted they had never encountered a case that pierced so deeply. The sheer betrayal. A husband murdering his pregnant wife, a father killing his children, struck at the core of human trust. Reporters called it one of the most disturbing family tragedies in American memory. And Frank's quiet words carried through it all, echoing louder than headlines or analysis. How could he do this to his own children? The recovery of Shanann, Bella, and Cece was more than the conclusion of a search. It was the confirmation of the unimaginable, the unveiling of a crime that defied logic. Officers carried their bodies with care, each movement deliberate, as if the dignity denied to them in death might be restored in recovery. The site in Weld County was left behind, but the memory of what was found there would never fade. The image of a shallow grave, the stench of oil tanks, the silence of investigators standing stunned in the sun. It was a crime scene that turned into a symbol of betrayal, one that would forever define the name Chris Watts. And for the Rzusek family, the nightmare was only beginning. They had lost Shanann, they had lost Bella and Cece, they had lost baby Nico. But in the weeks ahead, they would face Chris in court, forced to sit just feet away from the man who had destroyed their lives. And there, Frank Rzusek would find the words that spoke not only for his family, but for a nation in mourning. In late August of 2018, Weld County prosecutors filed the charges that would define the case against Christopher Lee Watts. He faced 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Shanann, and 2 for each of his daughters under different theories of law. He was also charged with unlawful termination of a pregnancy for the killing of baby Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased body for discarding Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. The courtroom filings were stark, each count carrying the weight of a life lost. For the Rzusek family, the words on paper did not begin to capture the reality of their grief, yet they represented the first step toward justice. Prosecutors now faced a decision that was as much moral as legal, whether to seek the death penalty. Colorado still allowed it at the time, though juries rarely imposed it. The facts of the case seemed to demand it. A pregnant mother, 2 small children, the cruelty of their disposal in oil tanks. Behind closed doors, prosecutors discussed the aggravating factors and consulted experts, but they also turned to the people who mattered most, Frank and Sandy Rzusek. In private meetings, prosecutors laid out what the pursuit of death would mean: years of appeals, graphic testimony, and the constant reopening of wounds. For Frank, already hollowed by loss, the thought of reliving Shanann's murder day after day was unbearable. Through tears, he told them plainly, "We want justice, but we can't endure more suffering. We want this over." It was an agonizing choice. The Rzuseks had been thrust into a dilemma no family should face: pursue the harshest punishment available or protect themselves from endless trauma. They chose peace, knowing nothing could balance the scales. Their decision carried weight. Prosecutors announced they would not seek the death penalty, citing the family's wishes. Instead, they would pursue life sentences without parole. To some, this felt merciful. To others, it was controversial. Commentators debated whether sparing Chris Watts' life denied justice to Shanann and the children. But for the Rzuseks, the calculus was personal, not political. They needed an end to the nightmare. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts entered the Weld County courtroom shackled and wearing an orange prison jumpsuit. His head was lowered, his face pale. Reporters and family members filled the gallery, the silence broken only by the shuffle of papers and the clink of chains. When asked by the judge how he wished to plead, Chris spoke in a steady but lifeless voice: "Guilty." He repeated the word 9 times, once for each charge. The sound was chilling in its flatness, not defiant, not remorseful, just empty. Around the room, people sat frozen. Shanann's family lowered their heads, some clutching tissues, others holding hands tightly. Prosecutors watched silently, the weight of months of work distilled into one word repeated again and again. The guilty plea carried enormous consequence. There would be no trial. No jury would hear the full scope of evidence. No parade of witnesses would testify to Shanann's life or the girl's innocence. The case moved directly to sentencing. For the Rzuseks, the plea was both relief and agony. Relief, because they would not have to sit through years of hearings that would strip open their wounds. Agony, because Chris offered no explanation, no motive, no words of remorse. The questions that haunted them, why he did it, how he could kill his own children, remained unanswered. His plea admitted guilt, but offered no humanity. The public, too, wrestled with the outcome. Television anchors replayed footage of Chris saying guilty again and again, their voices heavy with disbelief. Legal analysts explained that the plea was likely strategic, a way to avoid the death penalty and control his own fate. Others speculated it was an act of cowardice, a refusal to face the full weight of trial. On social media, debates raged. Some asked why justice stopped short of execution, while others supported the family's choice to spare themselves years of trauma. Still, the question lingered. What did Chris' guilty plea really mean? Was it acceptance, or simply another performance by a man who had mastered masks. And then there was the sense of betrayal, felt in layers across the nation. For the neighbors on Saratoga Trail, it was the betrayal of trust. Realizing the quiet man who waved politely was hiding unimaginable darkness. For the community of Frederick, it was the betrayal of safety, proof that evil could live behind the walls of an ordinary home. For the Rzuseks, it was the most personal betrayal of all. The man they welcomed as a son-in-law, the man entrusted with Shanann's happiness, had destroyed everything. Each betrayal cut differently, but together they deepened the nation's outrage. The guilty plea brought finality to the legal process, but it did not bring peace. It answered the question of guilt, but left the larger mystery, motive, unresolved. For the Rzuseks, that unanswered question would never fade. And as the case moved toward sentencing, they prepared to face Chris in person. Frank Rzusek, a father who had carried his grief in silence, would stand in that courtroom, look Chris directly in the eye, and speak words that would echo far beyond those four walls. "You heartless monster. Prison is too good for you." On November 19, 2018, the Weld County Courthouse in Greeley, Colorado, was filled to the brim. Journalists lined the benches with recorders poised, their pens still against their notepads as if movement might disturb the weight of the moment. Family, friends, and strangers who had come to support the Rzuseks sat pressed together, clutching tissues, their faces pale with anticipation. The hum of whispered prayers and muffled sobs filled the air until the judge entered, bringing with him a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. At the defense table, Christopher Lee Watts sat shackled, his wrists bound, his ankles clinking against the floor. His head hung low, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on the table as if staring at the wood grain could shield him from the stares burning holes into his back. He never once turned to face the family whose lives he had shattered. The judge began by reading the charges aloud. 5 counts of first-degree murder. 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased body. After each charge, the word guilty followed, flat and final. The words carried no inflection, yet they hit the gallery like blows, a drumbeat of loss. Some in the audience shifted in their seats, the creak of wood echoing against the walls. Others bowed their heads, the silence punctured only by quiet sniffles. Shanann's family sat at the front, their grief etched into every line of their faces, knowing this was the moment they had waited for, the moment their voices could finally be heard. The first to rise was Frankie Rzusek, Shanann's younger brother. He spoke quietly at first, his words trembling as he looked at the man he had once called family. He described his sister as a devoted mother, someone who worked tirelessly despite lupus and never stopped loving her children. He told the court about Bella's bright smile, Cece's playful energy, and baby Nico, a boy who would never have the chance to live. Then his tone sharpened. "I trusted you to take care of my sister," he said, his voice breaking. "And instead, you took her life. You killed her babies." The courtroom air grew tighter, the sound of a single gasp echoing from the gallery. Frankie's pain was raw, his words cutting into the stillness with the truth of betrayal. Next was Sandy Rzusek, Shanann's mother. She walked slowly to the podium, steadying herself against Frank's arm, her steps deliberate and heavy. She looked at Chris, not at the floor, not at the judge, but directly at the man who had once eaten at her table. Her voice trembled, yet her words carried unmistakable strength. "You should be in hell where you belong," she said, each syllable thick with grief. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she continued. "I gave you my daughter. I trusted you with my grandbabies. And you betrayed us in the cruelest way possible." Her words turned to the spiritual, her faith colliding with her anguish. "God will judge you, and his judgment will be far greater than any this court can give." The gallery was silent except for the rustle of tissues and the quiet sound of someone stifling a sob. Even court officers, stoic by training, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And then it was Frank Rzusek's turn. Slowly, he rose from his chair, his face pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the podium. For months, he had carried his grief in silence, whispering disbelief to himself, pacing sleepless nights in North Carolina. Now he stood just feet from the man who had murdered his daughter, his granddaughters, and his unborn grandson. He looked at Chris, forcing him to feel the gaze he had avoided all morning, and spoke with a voice that trembled but did not falter. "You heartless monster, prison is too good for you." The words cracked through the courtroom like thunder, freezing every breath, every movement. For a moment, even the judge sat still, the echo of those words filling the chamber like a verdict of their own. The impact was immediate. Reporters stopped writing, their pens hovering midair. A woman in the gallery clutched her chest, whispering through tears. A cameraman lowered his lens, unable to look through it any longer. Some sobbed openly, others bowed their heads, their shoulders shaking silently. Chris sat motionless, his jaw tightening, his lips pressed into a thin line. He did not raise his eyes. He did not react. His silence was as chilling as Frank's words were searing. The judge eventually continued, his voice measured but stern. He condemned Chris for his actions, calling the murders the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled in my career. Then came the sentence. 5 life sentences without parole, plus 48 years for unlawful termination of pregnancy, and 36 years for tampering with bodies. It was a sentence designed to ensure Chris Watts would never walk free again. The shackles on his wrists clinked as deputies led him away, his head still bowed, his eyes never meeting those he had betrayed. But in that courtroom, it was not the judge's words or the length of the sentence that defined the moment. It was the voice of a father, trembling, furious, broken, but unflinching. "You heartless monster, prison is too good for you." That line became the moral judgment, a phrase replayed on television, quoted in headlines, and whispered by strangers across the country. It was more than condemnation. It was love for Shanann and her children crystallized into a single unforgettable sentence. As the courtroom emptied, the Rzuseks held one another. Sandy wept into Frank's shoulder. Frankie placed his hand over his father's back, and together they walked out into the cold November air. Reporters rushed to file stories. Cameras captured the family's departure, but nothing could capture the weight of what they carried. For the public, the case was ending with a life sentence. For the Rzuseks, the real sentence was one of lifelong grief. That day, parents across America hugged their children tighter. Communities gathered in vigils, repeating the victims' names so they would not be forgotten. And in every retelling, Frank's words remained, echoing long after the courtroom doors closed. They were words born of love, of pain, of fury, and they ensured that Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico would be remembered not only for how they died, but for how deeply they were loved. The morning after sentencing, Frank Rzusek's words traveled farther than the walls of the Weld County Courthouse. News anchors replayed the footage on national television, his trembling voice captured in headlines and sound bites. CNN ran the banner, "Father confronts killer. Prison is too good for you." Local stations in Colorado opened their broadcasts with Frank's face, his voice cutting through the noise of pundits and analysts. For many, it was the single line that defined the entire case. It was not legal jargon or a prosecutor's argument. It was the raw fury of a father who had lost everything. In vigils across Colorado and in Aberdeen, North Carolina, the phrase became part of the memorials. At one gathering, a woman held a poster with Shanann's smiling face, and beneath it in black paint were Frank's words. Outside the Watts home on Saratoga Trail, candles flickered beside stuffed animals, and someone had scrawled the sentence on a handmade sign, propping it against the porch. Strangers repeated it on social media, pairing it with photos of Bella and Cece, adding hearts and angel wings. The words carried because they were unpolished, because they were human. They spoke not just of rage, but of the love that loss had sharpened into something unforgettable. With the case concluded, debate ignited across the country. Legal commentators filled television panels, arguing over whether Chris Watts had been spared the punishment his crimes deserved. Some said the murders were so calculated, so cruel, that death would have been the only just response. Others defended the decision, reminding viewers that the Rzusek family had pleaded with prosecutors not to pursue execution. In homes, in workplaces, and on message boards, people asked the same questions. Was life without parole truly justice? Could a prison cell ever equal the destruction of 4 lives? The discussions were heated, but beneath them all was the same disbelief. How could a man, a father, carry out such an act against his own children? For the Rzuseks, The legal arguments were distant compared to the reality waiting for them at home. After the sentencing, Frank and Sandy returned to North Carolina. Their house, once filled with Shanann's voice and the laughter of visiting grandchildren, was unbearably quiet. Sandy often found herself folding and refolding Shanann's old clothes, unable to pack them away, pressing fabric to her face as though it might still carry her daughter's scent. Frank walked into Shanann's childhood room more than once, standing silently in the doorway, staring at the framed photographs on the dresser. Each night the silence pressed harder, broken only by whispered prayers. Their surviving son, Frankie, carried his own burden. Grief for his sister and nieces, anger at Chris, and the responsibility of holding his parents together. Yet, even in their grief, the family made a decision. They would not allow Shanann to be remembered only for how she died. They began speaking publicly about her resilience, her humor, her devotion as a mother. Sandy described Shanann's daily fight with lupus, how she pushed through exhaustion to provide for Bella and Cece. Frank told reporters that his daughter had built a life from determination and love, and that her legacy was not destruction, but strength. Together, they created the Shanann Watts Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and raising awareness of coercive control. Their message was simple but powerful. Shanann's life mattered. Bella and Cece's laughter mattered. Baby Nico's brief heartbeat mattered. While the Rzuseks turned their pain into purpose, Chris Watts began serving his sentence. Initially held in Colorado, he was quickly transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, for his own safety. There, he was stripped of the suburban image he had once projected and reduced to inmate number 674796. Reports from inside described a life of rigid routine. He awoke early, ate the same meals as every other prisoner, and worked menial jobs like mopping floors or serving food. He was allowed limited recreation time, but spent much of his day confined to his cell. Gone were the gym memberships, the new clothes, the secret meetings with a mistress. His world had shrunk to concrete, steel, and surveillance. Yet even in prison, Chris sought attention. He received letters from strangers, some from women fascinated by the case, and he responded to several. He claimed to have found God, filling his time with Bible reading and prayers, telling correspondents that he had been forgiven. But those gestures rang hollow outside the prison walls. To the Rzuseks, and to the public, no amount of scripture or self-reflection could undo what he had done. Inmates reportedly threatened him, and he lived under near-constant watch, protected not for his innocence, but for the notoriety of his guilt. His punishment was life without freedom, but it was not equal to the sentence his victim's family carried. The contrast could not have been sharper. Chris lived each day under structure and control, knowing what he would eat, where he would sleep, how long he would exercise. The Rzuseks lived each day under the weight of grief, with no such certainty. For Frank, mornings began with the ache of absence. For Sandy, holidays were a reminder of children's voices missing from the table. For Frankie, every story he heard about his sister came with the sting of her absence. Their sentence was endless, their parole date non-existent. No bars confined them, yet they lived in a prison of loss. And still, Frank's words continued to echo. They were quoted in news articles, repeated in documentaries, etched into the memory of those who followed the case. But as time passed, the words took on new layers. For some, they remained an expression of fury. For others, they reflected the depth of love, the love of a father for a daughter, of a grandfather for children stolen from him. They were not just about punishment, they were about memory. Frank had spoken not only to Chris but to the world, ensuring that the story of Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico would never be reduced to silence. The Watts case did not fade. It lived on in books, podcasts, and Netflix documentaries, in community vigils, and in the quiet corners of homes where parents whispered to their children, promising them safety. But for the Rzuseks, the story was lived every day. It was lived in the folding of Shanann's clothes, in the lighting of candles on birthdays that would never be celebrated, in the photographs arranged carefully in their living room. Their journey was not toward closure, for such a thing does not exist in the face of such loss. Their journey was toward preservation, keeping Shanann's name alive, speaking Bella and Cece's names aloud, and ensuring that Nico was remembered as more than a life denied. And for the public who watched from afar, the lesson endured. The Watts case revealed how evil can hide behind ordinary walls, how danger can lurk behind smiles and family photographs. It forced conversations about domestic violence, about control and coercion, about the warning signs often ignored. But it also revealed something deeper, that love, even when broken, speaks louder than cruelty. In a Colorado courtroom, Frank Rzusek's trembling voice rose above law and silence alike. His words, born from love and carved by grief, became a reminder to the world that memory is stronger than murder. The Watts murders did more than shock a quiet Colorado town. They forced America to confront unsettling truths about hidden lives and the fragility of trust within families. On the surface, Chris Watts seemed ordinary, a man with a stable job, 2 young daughters, and a pregnant wife who adored him. Neighbors waved at him in the driveway. Co-workers saw him as reliable. Family photos showed vacations, birthday parties, and smiling faces. But beneath that image, he carried secrets, an affair, mounting financial pressures, and a desire to abandon the family he had once promised to protect. The contrast was stark, and it left people asking how darkness could exist behind such familiar walls. The case revealed that betrayal can be quiet long before it is violent. Shanann's social media pages showed love and devotion, but text messages recovered later revealed a marriage straining under Chris' emotional distance. While she planned for baby Nico, he planned excuses to see Nicole Kessinger. He told Shanann he felt confused, even as he sent affectionate messages to another woman. That double life, smiling husband on one side, secret partner on the other, was not just a personal betrayal. It was the kind of fracture that, left unchecked, destroyed an entire family. For many, it was a reminder that betrayal does not always shout. Sometimes, it whispers until it is too late. This was not only a story of broken vows, but of the deepest violation of trust, a father killing his children. For Frank and Sandy Rzusek, this betrayal was unbearable. They had welcomed Chris as family, celebrated his marriage to Shanann, trusted him to raise Bella and Cece with love. Instead, he silenced their laughter and ended the life of an unborn grandson. That violation, the destruction of the bond between parent and child, cut beyond the Rzusek's grief. It pierced the nation's conscience, forcing every parent who heard the story to ask, how could anyone do this to their own children? In that grief, Frank Rzusek's voice became more than one man's anger. When he stood in the courtroom and called Chris Watts a heartless monster, when he declared that prison is too good for you, his words resonated far beyond Weld County. They were repeated in headlines, quoted in vigils, and whispered by grieving parents who felt their own pain reflected in his voice. They became a voice for all who had lost children to violence, all who had felt the weight of betrayal where safety should have been. Frank did not plan his statement for effect. It rose from a place where words fail, but grief demands expression. That is why it endures. His words grew into more than fury. They became testimony. For some, they were a sharper judgment than the sentence itself. For others, they were proof that love, even when crushed, still speaks with power. Months later, at vigils, his line appeared on posters beneath Shanann's smiling face. In interviews, journalists recalled the moment as the emotional peak of the trial. The statement lived on because it spoke to something universal, the refusal of a parent to let their child's memory be reduced to silence. Yet even as the world moved on, the scars remained. For Sandy, they were found in quiet moments, folding Shanann's clothes, unable to part with them, pressing fabric to her face as though scent could bring her daughter back. For Frank, they lived in sleepless nights, walking through a house that felt unbearably empty, whispering Shanann's name in the dark. For Frankie, they lived in the burden of being the surviving sibling, carrying both his own grief and the responsibility of protecting his parents from despair. These details rarely reached the headlines, but they were the true aftermath. They revealed that while justice was delivered in court, the sentence of grief was carried daily at home. The case also lived on in the public memory. Documentaries, podcasts, and books returned to it again and again. The Netflix documentary American Murder, The Family Next Door brought millions face to face with Shanann's videos, Chris interviews, and the body cam footage from the days she went missing. Viewers who had not followed the case in real time were confronted with its horror years later. The Watts case became more than a tragedy. It became a cultural reference point, a cautionary tale of hidden abuse and the dangers of coercive control. It sparked conversations about domestic violence, about the ways charm can mask cruelty, and about the importance of paying attention when something feels wrong. Evil, the case reminded us, does not end with a conviction. It lingers in birthdays uncelebrated, in school photos that will never be taken, in the silence of homes once filled with children's voices. It lingers in the hearts of families who wake every morning to the absence of the people they loved most. Chris Watts is confined within prison walls, but the sentence borne by the Rzuseks has no end date. No parole, no reprieve. Grief has no finish line. And so we return to that November morning in the courtroom. The benches creaked under the weight of bodies pressed together in silence. The air was heavy with anticipation, with anger, with sorrow. Chris Watts sat shackled, staring at the table, refusing to meet the gaze of those he had betrayed. And across from him, Frank Rzusek rose. His voice shook, his hands trembled, but his words were steady. He looked at the man who had destroyed his family and spoke the truth that no judge or jury could capture. "You heartless monster, prison is too good for you." This time, the words are not just a father's cry. They are an echo, through the courtroom, through the nation, through every parent who has buried a child. They are more than a condemnation of Chris Watts. They are a reminder of what was lost and of the love that remains. And as the images of Shanann, Bella, Cece, and baby Nico fade, the echo of Frank's voice lingers, haunting and unshakable. "You heartless monster, prison is too good for you." Their names must not fade into the shadow of the man who stole them. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico deserve to be remembered for the love they gave, the joy they brought, and the futures they should have had. To honor them is to speak their names, to share their stories, and to carry forward the strength that Shanann showed every day as a mother and daughter. But as we close this chapter, we ask you, what is true justice in cases like this? Is it the weight of a prison sentence? Or is it the legacy of love carried by the ones left behind? Your voice matters, and your reflection matters. If this story moved you, we invite you to keep their memory alive. Subscribe to this channel, share this documentary, and join us in ensuring that victims are remembered for their lives, not just their deaths. Together, we can turn tragedy into a call for awareness, compassion, and change.